So in this lesson, we're going to work on a method that will allow us to add granular cluster offset controls to the brow that will more or less ride along with the blend shapes. It will inherit the deltas, both translational and orientation of the blend shape on, we'll use the brow here for this example, without getting into a deformation cycle. So the first thing we're going to do is create a simple cluster. I'm going to select the mesh, just turn off everything except for our surfaces, and then just paint a quick selection and create a cluster. Now the idea here is to create a granular or very small offset, something that will be added at the end of the skin cluster and blend shapes, so that you can go in and plus or tweak what those two things can give you. So these will tend to be fairly small in the area that they'll influence, although you can create them as broad as you would like, and something that you would want to add at the end after the skin clusters and the blend shapes. So let's paint a quick selection, edit, paint selection tool. Just for the purposes of this example, it's going to be pretty, fast and loose. Again, the idea is just to add something to allow the animator to sort of tweak what they're getting. Okay, so with those vertices selected, I'm going to select the form, create cluster. Back in the object mode. Okay, so we have our cluster handle here. Okay, so it's moving around fine. So what we're going to do in order to avoid a deformation cycle is we need to allow this cluster, we need to get this cluster to derive its position and orientation of the handle that drives the cluster by an object that's outside the hierarchy. And what I mean by that is if we look at the cluster here, I'm going to graph it in the graph editor by hypergraph by selecting the input and output connections. So we can see here we have a cluster handle, and if we hover over the pink arrow, we can see that the world matrix of this cluster handle is connecting to the matrix of the cluster. So basically what that means is that the position and orientation of this cluster handle is actually driving the cluster, which in turn drives the deformations. So I'm going to create a secondary object, a locator, that we're going to use to drive the matrix of the cluster. So create locator. So here we have our locator. I'm going to quickly rename this. Okay, so I'm going to select the cluster handle, shift select the new locator that we've selected, and then graph both of these, once again by hitting the input and output connections in the hypergraph. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect the world matrix of this new locator to the matrix of the cluster 1 node. So middle mouse drag and drop the locator node over the cluster 1 node, and we're going to select the other, which will bring up the connection editor. Okay, so now we can see that the matrix of the cluster is connected already. So I'm going to select the world matrix of the cluster of the brow control locator and connect that to the matrix of the cluster. So now we can see this cluster handle is no longer connected to the cluster, whereas the world matrix of this locator is now connected into the matrix of the cluster. So what we're doing here is we're telling the locator or the cluster to get its matrix position, orientation, and scale information from a new object, in this case the control locator. So I have one more step. If we select this new this locator, we can see that we have a connection into the mesh, but if we move it around, first of all, it's way at the origin. It doesn't have any effect whatsoever on the mesh. We need one more step here. What we're going to do is connect the replace the handle, the transform information of this cluster with the locator. And we can do that by selecting the cluster handle, opening the attribute editor, and then selecting on the cluster handle shape tab, and here's the weighted node. And with this weighted node, we can change this from cluster1 handle to cave01 brow control. So we'll just type in the name of this locator, cave01. Wow. Okay, so now what we're saying is that the world space transformations of the cluster will now be driven by this locator. So now if we select the cluster handle, it has no connection whatsoever into this mesh. We can actually delete it at this point. Now if we select this brow control, we can see it's moving the cluster. Okay, so one more thing we need to do here. So I'm going to create an object, simple group node, edit, group. I'm going to point and orient constraint this group node to the main head joint so that it will get all the position and orientation of the main head joint there. As a matter of fact, I'm going to use the head 2 joint. I'm sorry, the head 3 joint, since we can rotate this up and move the brows up separately from the head. So with the brow 3 joint selected, I'm going to shift select the null, the empty group node, then select constrain point and constrain orient. If you have scaling, you may want to constrain the scale as well. But in this case, we're just concerned with the position and orientation. I'm going to move the pivot of this locator up to where this group node is. I'm sorry, up to where the cluster handle originally was. Okay. Everything's still working fine. So now what we're going to do is we're simply going to parent this locator, which is driving the cluster, to this group node, which is getting the position and orientation information from the head 3 joint. So select the child, which is the locator, shift select the parent, which will be the group node, and then hit P. You can see we get an intermediary group node, which is used to preserve the position of the cluster. Okay, everything's looking okay in the default position. We're going to see that when we rotate the head and activate the blend shape, we're going to get a deformation order issue. Let's do that. Select this. You can see we have the orientation of the head. Okay, but we're getting odd movement on the cluster here. It's not quite following the orientation of the handle. Let's go back to default and select the mesh and then change the deformation order. So with the mesh selected, we'll select the box with the inward pointing arrow, which shows the list of inputs of the selected object. Click on that and then select all inputs. So we can see the cluster is the last deformation in this deformation stack. We want to change its order so that it happens after the blend shape but before the skin cluster. So middle mouse, drag and drop it beneath the skin cluster. Now let's look at what we have again. Let's go to this position here where the head sort of cocked to the side. Select our brow control. Okay, so we're getting the orientation that we want, matching the general orientation of the head. Okay, so far so good. Make a few quick changes here. We still don't have that C from the cluster handle. We can get rid of that by selecting the brow control locator, opening the attribute editor, select the cluster handle shape, object display, turn the visibility off. So with that still selected, I'm going to select the control shape and make sure that that locator is no longer invisible. So go to object display. Once again, this is on the shape node of that brow locator. Turn the visibility off and then click on the brow control tab, which is the transform. Open the display frame and display the handle. So there you can see we have a selection handle here. Now we can easily go in and find this. Okay. So I'm going to activate a blend shape. So we have our head and then off position. Dial in one of the brow blend shapes. You can see it leaves the handle behind, but the offsets not only follow the head transformations of the skin cluster, but is also relative to the blend shape. Although it doesn't ride exactly on top of it, we do more or less get the this cluster does sort of continue to follow what the blend shape's doing, and that's because it's triggered afterwards. So there's a simple way to add granular controls, offsets that more or less ride along with the blend shape, and the fact that it will inherit the general position and orientation of the offset head, and the orientation and offset of the cluster that we've created here sort of play along and match what we'll get with the head in general. So once again, a simple way to adding granular controls on top of the blend shape, getting the basic orientation of the head, and then we're avoiding a cycle check error because since we've parented to an object which is outside the hierarchy but gets the position and orientation of the head, we can avoid a cycle check error by doing that.